They told me there was no way. Emily Carter whispered the words into the sterile air of the hospital room, her eyes fixed on the thin, pale hand of her 6-year-old son lying on the narrow bed, his chest rising and falling with the steady beep of the monitor that seemed to mock her helplessness. The room smelled faintly of antiseptic mixed with the tang of medicine, the fluorescent lights overhead casting a cold, unyielding glow on the polished linoleum floor. Machines hummed and clicked in a rhythm that made her pulse race in tandem, each tiny alarm a sharp reminder of how little time they had. Emily ran a trembling hand over her son's damp forehead, feeling the heat beneath her fingers and the stubborn determination in her heart. She glanced at the pile of medical bills on the counter, the numbers screaming impossibility, a total that would crush even the strongest of spirits. Her single-mom determination had carried her through sleepless nights, double shifts, and empty fridges, but nothing could have prepared her for this. Outside, the hospital corridor echoed with footsteps and hushed conversations, the distant murmur of a janitor pushing a cart blending with the occasional ring of a phone. Yet inside this small room, every second seemed to stretch into eternity. Emily's gaze flickered to the surgical tray neatly arranged but untouched, sterile instruments glinting under the harsh lights. Waiting for hands guided by authority she couldn't command. She swallowed hard, forcing her lips to press together, each breath a struggle against the rising tide of fear, yet her posture remained firm, a quiet testament to years of resilience. The doors suddenly creaked open, and the world seemed to shift as a tall figure stepped into the room, his presence commanding attention even without a word spoken. Richard Bennett, the CEO of a major medical technology firm, moved with a deliberate calm, his tailored navy suit contrasting sharply against the sterile whiteness of the hospital walls, polished leather shoes clicking softly on the linoleum. He paused for a moment, scanning the room, eyes sharp but not unkind, taking in the sight of a mother poised on the edge of despair and a child too young to understand the gravity of the moment. Emily's chest tightened, her fingers curling around the edge of the bed rail, heart hammering as if trying to escape her chest. The CEO approached the nurse's station, exchanged a few quick, precise words with the attending doctor, and then turned his gaze back to Emily and her son. Without hesitation, he spoke with authority that left no room for argument. Begin the procedure. Now. The words fell like a decisive gavel, echoing in the sterile space, cutting through the lingering anxiety and disbelief. Emily blinked, stunned, unable to fully process the rapid shift in the room's energy. The nurses moved quickly, a flurry of coordinated motion as instruments were handed, monitors adjusted, and surgical gowns snapped into place. The once static room became a controlled storm of activity, each movement purposeful, each glance a silent acknowledgement of urgency. Emily held her son's hand tightly, feeling the tremor in his fingers and the warmth of life pulsing beneath the surface, a fragile but persistent signal that hope had not abandoned them. Her eyes filled with tears that she dared not release, instead channeling every ounce of her fear, love, and determination into the strength she projected for him. She whispered a soft reassurance, words almost lost amid the bustle. "It's going to be okay, I promise." The surgeon's voice cut through, calm and steady, explaining each step in a manner designed to soothe, while commanding precision. Emily watched as the team moved like a well-rehearsed orchestra, every action deliberate, every pause timed perfectly to the beat of urgency that now governed the room. Outside, the fluorescent corridor continued its endless march of time, but within these walls, a new rhythm had taken hold, one dictated not by fear, but by decisive action, human courage, and the unwavering commitment of a stranger who had refused to allow circumstance to dictate fate. Emily's shoulders relaxed fractionally, a small but significant surrender to the sudden possibility that perhaps, just perhaps, they could overcome this, that love, resolve, and intervention could converge to turn the impossible into something real. The doors to the operating suite swung closed with a soft hiss, separating Emily Carter from the only person who mattered in her world. For a moment, she simply stood there, staring at the narrow window in the door as though she could somehow see through steel, glass, and uncertainty. Then the reality of waiting settled over her shoulders like a weight she could not put down. The hallway felt colder now. The bright hospital lights seemed harsher. Every ticking second stretched longer than the last. Emily slowly lowered herself into a chair near the wall, clasping her hands together so tightly her knuckles turned pale. Across the corridor, nurses moved with practiced efficiency, exchanging charts and quiet conversations. Somewhere nearby, a machine beeped steadily. A janitor pushed a cart past without looking up. Life continued around her as if nothing extraordinary was happening. Yet for Emily, the entire universe had narrowed to a single operating room. She closed her eyes and remembered another hospital room years earlier. She had been 23, exhausted, terrified, and completely alone when her son Noah was born. There had been no husband waiting beside her, no wealthy relatives, no safety net, just a frightened young woman holding a newborn baby and making a promise she barely understood at the time. She would never give up on him. Not ever. Through every difficult year that followed, that promise had become her compass. When rent was overdue, she found extra shifts. When food was scarce, she ate less so Noah could eat more. When exhaustion threatened to break her spirit, she reminded herself why she kept going. Noah had always been her reason. A sudden movement pulled her back to the present. Richard Bennett emerged from a nearby conference room, his expression thoughtful as he reviewed information on a tablet. He was surrounded by executives and hospital administrators only moments before, yet now he walked alone. Emily watched him approach, unsure of what to say. People like him existed in a different world. A world of private jets, boardrooms, and opportunities she had only seen in magazines. Richard noticed her, watching and paused. For a brief moment, neither spoke. Then he sat down in the chair beside her. Not across from her. Not standing over her. Beside her. The gesture surprised her more than anything else that had happened that day. "How old is he?" Richard asked quietly. 6, Emily replied. Her voice cracked slightly. "He turned 6 last month." Richard nodded. "That is a good age." Emily gave a faint smile. "He wanted a bicycle for his birthday." She looked down at her hands. "I could not afford the one he wanted." Richard remained silent, listening. Truly listening. It was something Emily had not experienced often. Most people heard enough to respond. Very few listened enough to understand. "He never complained," she continued. "He just smiled and said maybe next year." The memory caused her eyes to glisten. Richard leaned back slightly and looked toward the operating room doors. "Children like that are rare." Emily laughed softly through her tears. "He is stronger than I am." Richard shook his head. "No. He learned that strength from somewhere." The words landed deeper than he could have known. Emily looked away, overwhelmed by an emotion she had not expected. Validation. For years she had worked quietly, unnoticed by most of the world. Nobody celebrated the sacrifices. Nobody applauded the long nights or impossible decisions. Yet somehow this stranger had seen what others missed. The hallway grew quiet again. Minutes continued passing. Then an hour. Then another. Nurses occasionally stepped through the doors, offering updates that revealed little but reassurance. The procedure was progressing. The doctors remained optimistic. Still, optimism felt fragile when so much was at stake. As the afternoon light faded beyond the distant hospital windows, Emily noticed something unusual. Richard had not left. His phone rang several times. He ignored it. Assistants arrived. He dismissed them. Important meetings waited somewhere beyond these walls. Yet he remained seated only a few feet away, watching, waiting, sharing the burden of uncertainty. Emily finally gathered the courage to ask the question that had lingered in her mind since the moment he arrived. "Why did you help us?" Richard stared ahead for several seconds before answering. "Because someone once helped me when they did not have to." Emily waited. "Who?" A faint smile crossed his face. Not the smile of a billionaire executive. The smile of someone remembering a chapter of life long before success found him. "A person I never forgot." Before he could say more, the operating room doors opened. Every conversation in the hallway seemed to disappear. Every sound faded. Emily rose to her feet instantly as a surgeon stepped into the corridor, still wearing surgical scrubs and a protective cap. The expression on the doctor's face revealed nothing at first. Emily's heart pounded so loudly she could barely hear herself breathe. The surgeon removed his mask slowly and looked directly at her. Then he smiled. The smile appeared slowly, But once Emily saw it, the tension that had been gripping her chest for hours finally cracked. The surgeon stepped closer, his eyes warm behind the exhaustion of a long procedure. "Everything went well," he said. "The operation was successful." For a moment, Emily did not react. The word seemed too large to fit inside her mind. Successful. The word echoed through her like sunlight breaking through a storm cloud. Then her knees weakened. She pressed a trembling hand against her mouth as tears spilled freely down her cheeks. Not quiet tears. Not polite tears. These were the tears of a mother who had spent months carrying fear like a second heartbeat. Richard Bennett rose from his chair, but remained where he was, giving her space to absorb the moment. Emily covered her face and cried openly, every ounce of pressure finally escaping. The surgeon waited patiently before continuing. "He is resting now. The next 24 hours are important, but his outlook is very positive." Emily nodded repeatedly, unable to find words. The surgeon offered a reassuring smile and excused himself, disappearing down the corridor as other medical staff continued their work. For the first time all day, the hallway did not feel cold. The fluorescent lights seemed softer somehow. Even the constant sounds of the hospital carried a different rhythm. Hope had changed. Everything. A nurse soon appeared and guided Emily toward the recovery wing. Her footsteps felt unsteady as she followed. Every turn through the maze of hallways brought her closer to the moment she had imagined during countless sleepless nights. When she finally entered the recovery room, she stopped in the doorway. Noah lay peacefully beneath a light blanket, his small chest rising and falling in a steady rhythm. Machines still monitored his condition, but their sounds no longer felt threatening. They felt protective. Emily slowly approached the bed and took his hand. It was warm, real, present. She lowered her head and pressed her forehead gently against his fingers. "You did it, buddy," she whispered. "You did it." A faint smile appeared on Noah's sleeping face, as if somewhere deep in his dreams he had heard her voice. Emily remained there for several minutes, simply watching him breathe. There was no place on earth she would rather be. Eventually, she sensed someone standing quietly near the door. She looked up and saw Richard. He had not entered fully. He remained respectfully near the entrance. Emily stood and walked toward him. Her eyes were still red from crying, but they carried something different now. Relief. Gratitude. "Thank you does not seem big enough," she said softly. Richard glanced toward Noah before answering. "It does not have to be." Emily shook her head. "You changed his life." Richard looked away briefly. "No. The doctors changed his life. I only removed an obstacle." The answer sounded simple, but Emily knew better. Most people with power talked about helping. Very few acted when it mattered. Before she could respond, a hospital administrator hurried down the hallway carrying a folder. His expression shifted when he noticed Richard. "Mr. Bennett, I have been trying to reach you all afternoon." Richard accepted the folder. "What is it?" The administrator hesitated before speaking. "The board meeting. Several directors are waiting. They said it was urgent." Richard opened the folder, scanned the contents, then closed it again. "Reschedule." The administrator blinked. "Sir, reschedule all of it." The man looked genuinely confused. "Every meeting?" Richard nodded once. "Every meeting." The administrator reluctantly agreed and walked away. Emily stared after him. "You postponed everything?" Richard gave a small shrug. "Some things are more important." Emily had spent years around people who measured everything in dollars and schedules. She had worked for managers who viewed employees as numbers on spreadsheets. Yet this man, whose time was worth more than most people could imagine, had spent an entire day sitting in a hospital hallway beside a stranger. The realization left her speechless. As evening settled outside the hospital windows, the sky turning shades of orange and deep blue, Emily returned to Noah's bedside. Richard prepared to leave. He paused at the door and looked back one final time. Noah remained asleep, peaceful and safe. Emily sat beside him holding his hand. It was an ordinary image. A mother and her child. Yet something about it held extraordinary power. Richard watched for a moment before quietly saying, "Take care of him." Emily smiled through fresh tears. "I always will." Richard nodded and turned toward the hallway. But neither of them knew that the most surprising part of this story had not happened yet. Because hidden within Noah's medical file was a detail that would soon connect their lives in a way neither could possibly imagine. The next morning arrived quietly. Pale sunlight filtered through the hospital window, painting soft gold across the room where Noah continued to recover. For the first time in months, Emily Carter woke without the crushing weight of fear pressing against her chest. She had spent the night in an uncomfortable chair beside Noah's bed, yet she felt more rested than she had in years. Noah stirred beneath his blanket and slowly opened his eyes. The moment he saw his mother, a small smile appeared. It was not a dramatic moment. It was something far more powerful. It was normal. Emily immediately leaned forward and squeezed his hand. "Good morning, buddy." Noah blinked several times. "Did I miss school?" The question caught Emily completely off guard. A laugh escaped before she could stop it. Tears followed immediately after. Only Noah would worry about missing school after everything they had endured. "You have a few days off," she said gently. "Doctor's orders." Noah nodded seriously as if accepting an important business decision. Then he glanced around the room. "Are we okay?" Emily knew what he meant. Children often understood more than adults realized. He was not asking about the surgery. He was asking about the bills, the stress, the worry he had seen hidden behind her smiles for months. Emily brushed a hand through his hair. "We are okay." For the first time, she truly meant it. Later that morning, a physician entered carrying a chart. He reviewed Noah's progress with visible satisfaction before pausing unexpectedly at one section of the file. His expression shifted. Not concern, curiosity. He looked at Noah, then at Emily, then back at the chart. "That is interesting," he murmured. Emily immediately sat up straighter. "What is it?" The doctor smiled reassuringly. "Nothing bad. Actually, quite remarkable." He flipped through several pages. "Your son's recovery indicators are unusually strong." Emily frowned slightly. "Is that unusual?" The doctor nodded. "Very unusual, especially considering his medical history." Before Emily could ask another question, the doctor excused himself, saying he wanted to consult with another specialist. The conversation lingered in her mind long after he left. Meanwhile, several floors below, Richard Bennett stood inside a private conference room reviewing reports from his company. His assistant had arrived before sunrise with enough paperwork to fill an entire table. Quarterly projections, investor updates, expansion plans. Yet Richard found himself distracted. His eyes repeatedly drifted toward the hospital tower visible through the glass wall. Finally, his assistant noticed. "You are thinking about the boy." Richard set down the report. "Maybe." The assistant smiled. "You postponed 2 board meetings and ignored 3 major investors." Richard leaned back. "That sounds unlike me. Very unlike you." For a moment, neither spoke. Then the assistant slid a folder across the table. "There is something else." Richard opened it. Inside was a copy of a research report, connected to Noah's case. His eyes moved across the pages quickly. Then they stopped. His expression changed. Not shock. Recognition. Deep, unmistakable recognition. He looked up slowly. "Are these results confirmed?" "Twice," the assistant replied. Richard stared at the file for several seconds. 20 years earlier, his own younger brother had suffered from a rare condition that researchers spent decades trying to understand. The illness had shaped Richard's life in ways few people knew. It was one of the reasons he eventually invested billions into medical innovation. Now, sitting in front of him, was information connecting Noah to a breakthrough that scientists had been chasing for years. Not because Noah was famous, not because he was wealthy. Quite the opposite. The discovery had been hiding inside the medical records of an ordinary little boy whose mother could barely pay rent. Richard closed the folder carefully. Sometimes life whispered instead of shouted. Sometimes the most important stories appeared where nobody thought to look. Across the hospital, Emily sat beside Noah, helping him color in a children's activity book. They laughed together as he insisted on making every dinosaur bright blue. For the first time in a very long time, they looked like any other mother and son. Yet beyond the walls of that quiet room, events had already begun moving in a direction neither of them could see. Because the information hidden inside Noah's file was about to attract attention from people far beyond the hospital. And unlike Richard Bennett, not all of them would be motivated by kindness. By mid-afternoon, Emily Carter felt a calm she had not known in years, yet beneath it lingered a quiet anticipation. Noah had drifted back to sleep after a light snack and a story about blue dinosaurs, leaving her alone in the recovery room with only the soft hum of monitors and the distant shuffle of hospital staff as company. She pressed her hand against the blanket covering her son, willing him to remain peaceful, feeling both the weight and the wonder of the hours that had passed. Richard Bennett returned quietly, walking down the corridor without fanfare, his presence noticeable but unobtrusive. He did not carry the air of a man in a hurry, though his world outside these walls was governed by urgency and decisive action. Emily noticed him pause near the doorway, studying the monitors and the little hand she held. She did not speak immediately. There was nothing to say. The room itself had been transformed from a place of fear into one of potential, where every breath, every small movement, mattered more than schedules or expectations. Richard stepped closer and quietly lowered himself into the chair beside her, eyes focused on Noah without intruding, respecting the silent space Emily needed. Emily drew in a steadying breath, her mind replaying the moments from the day before, the tension, the fear, the unexpected grace that had arrived in the form of decisive action. "I cannot believe he is really doing better," she whispered. Richard nodded slowly. "Sometimes the body responds in ways science cannot predict," he said gently. "Sometimes the mind responds, too." Emily considered his words, the weight behind them, the quiet authority in his tone that spoke of both knowledge and empathy. It was a rare combination, and one she realized she had never witnessed outside the realm of stories or distant admiration. Outside, the hallways buzzed with the ordinary flow of hospital life. Yet inside this room, time seemed suspended, the only movement the subtle rise and fall of Noah's chest, the shifting light from the windows painting golden streaks across the walls. Emily's eyes traced each contour of her son's face, memorizing the moment, storing it in a way that would last longer than any photograph. Richard shifted slightly, observing her as she reflected, as if measuring the depth of her resilience. He finally spoke, softer this time. "You have done more than most could ever imagine." Emily lifted her gaze, meeting his eyes, unsure if he spoke to her, or to the room itself, or perhaps to the universe that had brought them together in this improbable alignment of circumstance. "I just did what I had to do," she said simply, her voice carrying the quiet dignity of someone who had endured months of unseen struggle. Richard allowed a small, approving smile, the kind that acknowledges courage without needing to announce it to the world. Emily noticed a shift in the room, a subtle, almost imperceptible lightness in the air, a sense that the barriers of worry had begun to lift. Outside the window, clouds drifted lazily across the late afternoon sky, and the hospital felt less like a place of fear and more like a space where human perseverance and kindness converged. Richard glanced at his watch, then back to Emily and Noah, and for a moment, the weight of his own responsibilities seemed distant, replaced by the quiet gravity of witnessing a life restored. Emily sat back slightly, letting her body relax into the chair, her hands still gripping the blanket. She realized, in that suspended silence, that this day would be remembered not for the machines or the charts or the procedures, but for the presence, the attention, and the compassion that had arrived at precisely the moment it was most needed. Noah stirred again, small movements pulling her fully back into the present, and Emily smiled softly, whispering a gentle word of encouragement to him. Richard remained seated, silently acknowledging the unspoken bond between mother and child, the delicate, profound connection that had guided them through uncertainty and into hope. And in that quiet, unassuming moment, it became clear that the extraordinary had been witnessed not in spectacle or announcement, but in the simple act of showing up, of remaining present, and of believing in the potential of life to persist against overwhelming odds. The following morning brought a different kind of energy to the hospital. Noah was stronger. Not dramatically stronger, not the sort of recovery that made headlines, but stronger in the ways that mattered. He sat up longer. He laughed more easily. He asked questions about when he could go home and whether his blue dinosaur drawing had survived the adventure. For Emily Carter, every small improvement felt like a miracle disguised as an ordinary moment. She watched him carefully as he ate breakfast, smiling when he proudly finished every bite. Across the room, sunlight poured through the windows, replacing the sterile atmosphere with something warmer, something closer to hope. Yet beyond the comfort of the recovery room, events were beginning to move faster than anyone realized. 2 floors above, a group of medical researchers gathered around a conference table covered with reports, scans, and laboratory data connected to Noah's case. Conversations remained professional, but excitement was impossible to hide. The unusual recovery markers documented in Noah's file were attracting increasing attention. Years of research had produced theories. Noah's results were producing evidence. One physician adjusted his glasses and reviewed the data again. Another leaned forward and pointed to a series of numbers highlighted in red. The conclusions were becoming harder to ignore. Meanwhile, Richard Bennett stood near a large window overlooking the city skyline. His assistant entered carrying additional documents. "More inquiries," she said. Richard accepted the folder without looking away from the view. "From who?" "Research organizations, pharmaceutical groups, medical foundations." Richard finally turned. "Already?" His assistant nodded. News travels quickly when breakthroughs are involved. Richard's expression darkened slightly. He knew exactly how quickly attention could shift from scientific curiosity to commercial interest. He had spent decades navigating a world where innovation often attracted people motivated by profits rather than purpose. Closing the folder, he made a decision. No information leaves this hospital without proper protection. His assistant understood immediately. "You are worried about the family." Richard nodded once. "They deserve privacy." Back in the recovery room, Emily was unaware of the conversations unfolding elsewhere. Her attention remained fixed on Noah, who was now proudly showing a nurse a collection of drawings he had created during recovery. The nurse laughed warmly as Noah explained the detailed adventures of a blue dinosaur that somehow became an astronaut, firefighter, and teacher all at once. Emily watched from across the room, grateful for the sound of her son's laughter. It had been far too long since she heard it so freely. Then a soft knock interrupted the moment. A senior physician entered accompanied by another specialist. Their expressions were kind, but serious. Emily immediately felt her stomach tighten. The doctors noticed her concern and smiled reassuringly. "Nothing is wrong," one of them said. Actually, quite the opposite. They sat down and carefully explained that Noah's recovery was drawing significant interest from the medical community. Emily listened quietly, struggling to process terminology and research details she had never encountered before. What she understood was simple. Noah's progress might help other children facing similar challenges in the future. The thought left her speechless. For years, she had felt invisible. Her struggles had happened quietly. Her sacrifices had gone unnoticed. Yet somehow her son, the little boy she had fought so hard to protect, might help change lives beyond his own. After the doctors left, Emily sat silently for several minutes. Noah noticed immediately. "Mom." She looked up. "Yes." "Are you crying again?" Emily laughed through fresh tears. "Maybe a little." Noah tilted his head thoughtfully. "Those look like happy tears." Emily smiled. "They are." Later that afternoon, Richard visited once more. This time Noah was awake and eager to talk. Within minutes, the 6-year-old had recruited one of the most powerful executives in America into an elaborate discussion about dinosaurs, space travel, and why pancakes were superior to every other breakfast food. Richard listened with surprising patience. Emily watched the exchange with amusement. For the first time, she saw something different beneath Richard's composed exterior. Not the billionaire, not the executive, simply a man enjoying a conversation with a child. Yet even as laughter filled the room, neither Emily nor Noah noticed several individuals gathering information elsewhere in the hospital. The growing attention surrounding Noah's case was beginning to spread beyond medical circles. And while some people saw hope, others were starting to see opportunity. 3 days later, the hospital felt almost different from the place Emily Carter had entered in desperation. The corridors that once seemed endless now carried familiar faces and encouraging smiles. Nurses stopped by simply to check on Noah. Doctors lingered longer than necessary, not because of concern, but because they genuinely enjoyed seeing his progress. His energy had returned faster than anyone expected. He spent his mornings drawing, his afternoons asking impossible questions, and his evenings planning all the things he wanted to do once he got home. Emily watched every moment with gratitude she could barely describe. Yet beyond the walls of Noah's room, a different kind of momentum was building. What had started as quiet medical interest was rapidly expanding. Research institutions requested consultations. Medical journals asked for access to anonymized data. Specialists from across the country wanted to understand what they were seeing. The hospital administration suddenly found itself navigating attention on a scale it had never anticipated. One afternoon, Emily returned from the cafeteria carrying a small tray with juice and crackers. As she approached Noah's room, she noticed two unfamiliar individuals speaking with hospital staff near the nurse's station. Their expensive suits stood out immediately. Their smiles seemed practiced. Their eyes constantly scanned the hallway. Emily thought little of it until one of them glanced toward Noah's room. The look lasted only a second, but something about it unsettled her. Later that day, Richard Bennett arrived and immediately sensed a shift in the atmosphere. Years in business had taught him to recognize patterns others overlooked. Attention, interest, opportunism. They often arrived wearing the same polite expressions. His assistant met him near the elevators with a concerned look. Several organizations are trying to gain access to information connected to the case. Richard's jaw tightened slightly. Have they contacted the family? Not directly. Yet. Richard looked toward Noah's floor. Make sure it stays that way. His assistant nodded. Already done. Meanwhile, inside the recovery room, Noah was explaining the rules of a card game he had mostly invented himself. Emily pretended to understand while secretly losing every round. Their laughter filled the room. For a few precious minutes, the outside world disappeared completely. Then a knock interrupted them. Richard stepped inside carrying a small gift bag. Noah's eyes widened immediately. Is that for me? Richard smiled. Maybe. Noah practically bounced in bed. Emily laughed as Richard handed over the bag. Inside was a children's telescope. Not an expensive luxury item. Not something flashy. Just a thoughtful gift from someone who remembered a conversation about space travel and blue dinosaur astronauts. Noah looked at it as though it were treasure. Seriously, he asked. Richard nodded. I hear future astronauts need to study the stars. Noah grinned so widely that even Emily found herself blinking back tears. Some gifts cost money. Others carried attention. This one carried attention. For a moment, the room felt wonderfully normal. Then Richard's phone vibrated. He glanced at the screen. The smile disappeared. Emily noticed immediately. Everything okay? Richard slipped the phone back into his pocket. Just business. But it was more than business. Several powerful organizations had begun competing for access to information connected to Noah's recovery. Investors were asking questions. Executives were making calls. Opportunities were being calculated. Numbers were being attached to possibilities. Richard understood exactly where that road could lead. He had traveled it many times before. The difference was that this time, at the center of the story, was a little boy who cared more about dinosaurs than research papers. A little boy whose mother had spent years protecting him from every hardship she could. That evening, after Noah fell asleep, Emily stood beside the hospital window watching city lights flicker across the skyline. Richard joined her quietly. Neither spoke at first. Finally, Emily broke the silence. Everything feels different now. Richard nodded. It is. She looked down toward the streets below. That scares me a little. Richard understood. Sometimes good news changed lives almost as much as bad news. You do not have to face it alone, he said. Emily turned toward him. For the first time since they met. She fully believed him. Yet neither realized how quickly those words would be tested. Because somewhere beyond the hospital, a major media outlet had just obtained details about Noah's extraordinary recovery. And by sunrise, the story that had begun inside one hospital room was about to become impossible to keep private. By sunrise, the hospital corridors were alive with an energy that was both familiar and unfamiliar. Emily Carter had spent another restless night beside Noah, watching him sleep and breathe steadily, each rise and fall of his chest a quiet triumph. She sipped her lukewarm coffee, letting the bitter warmth remind her that life continued outside the walls of the recovery room. Noah stirred, his small hand reaching out instinctively for her. She grasped it gently, feeling the rhythm of his tiny pulse under her fingers. Good morning, buddy, she whispered, careful not to startle him. He blinked sleepily and gave a lazy grin, already talking about which blue dinosaurs would be astronauts that day. Emily smiled, the kind of smile that carried both relief and cautious optimism. The quiet peace, however, was deceptive. Down the hall, Richard Bennett reviewed a stack of emails on his tablet. The subject lines were innocuous at first glance. Research inquiries, press requests, congratulatory notes from institutions. But the content revealed the growing magnitude of interest surrounding Noah's recovery. The story was spreading faster than any of them could have anticipated. Richard leaned back in the chair, folding his hands, eyes tracking the movements of staff and visitors passing through the main corridor. He had seen this pattern before. Curiosity evolved into attention, and attention could quickly become pressure. The hospital had to be protected. Emily, unaware of the storm brewing just beyond the recovery wing, arranged crayons and coloring sheets on the small table beside Noah. His enthusiasm was contagious. For a brief moment, she allowed herself to imagine normal life. School mornings, homework sessions, bedtime stories without fear or urgent appointments. The thought was a fleeting escape, yet it fortified her resolve. Suddenly, a nurse approached, gently tapping on the doorframe. She handed Emily a folder. "These are the consent forms and information requests from various research institutions," she explained softly. Emily's eyes widened, her grip tightening on the folder. She was exhausted, overwhelmed, and yet a part of her felt a strange pride. Her son, the child she had protected so fiercely, was becoming a beacon of hope, a story of human perseverance that others could learn from. Richard entered the room silently, observing the exchange. He crouched slightly to meet Emily's eyes. "Do not worry," he said quietly. "We will handle it. Your priority is Noah, and nothing else comes before that." Emily nodded, swallowing hard, her throat tight with emotion. "Thank you," she managed, her voice small but firm. Outside the window, the city was waking up, streetlights flickering off as the sun illuminated skyscrapers and rooftops. For Emily and Noah, the world beyond the hospital was starting to regain definition, the promise of everyday life slowly returning. Richard watched them for a moment longer, noting the extraordinary resilience and quiet courage in Emily's posture, the way her hands protected her son without overbearing control, the way Noah responded to love and patience with an innocence that was both fragile and strong. As he turned to leave, he paused once more. "Remember," he said, his voice carrying steady assurance, "this moment is yours. Everything else is secondary." Emily watched him walk away, her heart heavy with gratitude and awe. In the quiet that followed, Noah leaned against her shoulder, drawing blue dinosaurs with exaggerated astronaut helmets, and Emily allowed herself to imagine a future where every sunrise could carry the same promise of life, love, and the extraordinary power of human kindness. Outside, the first press inquiries were being filed, but inside the recovery room, time moved differently, measured by laughter, gentle whispers, and the steady heartbeat of a little boy who had survived against all odds. 2 weeks later, the hospital room stood empty. The monitors had been removed. The recovery equipment was gone. The quiet space that had once held fear, uncertainty, and hope now waited for its next patient. Across town, however, life was beginning again. Emily Carter stood outside the small apartment building she had called home for years, watching Noah race across a patch of grass with more energy than she had seen in months. The afternoon sun illuminated his face as he laughed, holding the telescope Richard Bennett had given him. Every few seconds he stopped, pointed it toward the sky, and announced a new discovery. Most of the discoveries were imaginary. Every single one was magnificent. Emily folded her arms and smiled. The ordinary moments felt extraordinary now. The sound of Noah's laughter, the warmth of sunlight, the simple fact that tomorrow existed. These were gifts she would never take for granted again. Life was not suddenly perfect. Bills still existed. Responsibilities remained. Challenges would come. But the shadow that had followed them for so long was finally gone. A few days after leaving the hospital, Emily received an invitation she never expected. Richard had arranged a private meeting at the headquarters of his company. The building itself was impressive, rising above the city skyline in glass and steel, but what struck Emily most was not the architecture. It was the welcome. Nobody looked down on her. Nobody treated her as an outsider. Employees greeted Noah by name. Staff members smiled warmly. For the first time in a corporate environment, Emily felt seen. Richard met them in a conference room overlooking the city. Noah immediately walked to the window and began identifying clouds shaped like dinosaurs. Richard listened with complete seriousness. Once Noah became distracted by the view, Richard turned his attention to Emily. "There is something I want to discuss," he said. Emily sat quietly, uncertain what to expect. Richard slid a folder across the table. Inside was an offer. Not charity. Not a handout. An opportunity. Over the previous weeks, Richard had learned more about Emily's background. He discovered the years she spent balancing multiple jobs. He learned about the online certification courses she completed late at night after Noah fell asleep. He saw determination, intelligence, and resilience hidden beneath circumstances that never allowed her a fair chance to demonstrate them. The position offered training, stability, benefits, and a future she had never imagined possible. Emily stared at the document for several seconds. Then she looked up. Why? Richard smiled softly. It was the same question she had asked him in the hospital. Because potential should never be ignored. Emily felt tears gathering again. Not because of the job itself, but because someone had recognized her value. For years, she had been surviving. Now she was being invited to build something more. Months passed. Seasons changed. Noah returned to school stronger than ever. His recovery continued exceeding expectations. Researchers continued studying the medical data that had generated so much interest, helping advance knowledge that could benefit countless families in the future. Yet despite the attention, Noah remained exactly who he had always been. A little boy who loved dinosaurs, space, and asking questions nobody could answer. Emily flourished in her new role, proving that the qualities which helped her survive difficult years also helped her succeed professionally. And Richard Bennett found himself visiting less as a rescuer and more as a friend. One evening, nearly a year after the surgery, all three stood together at a charity event supporting children's healthcare programs. The room was filled with donors, executives, physicians, and community leaders. Yet none of them represented the true story. The true story stood near the center of the room, holding a small telescope and talking enthusiastically about constellations. Richard watched Noah with a smile. Emily noticed. "You know," she said quietly, "you changed our lives." Richard looked toward the crowd before answering. "I think your son changed more lives than either of us realize." Emily followed his gaze. She understood. The story had never been about money. It had never been about status. It had never even been about luck. It was about people. One exhausted mother who refused to give up. One little boy who kept believing. One man who chose to act when action mattered most. Sometimes the most important changes do not begin with power. They begin with compassion. And while wealth can open doors, it is character that determines which doors are worth opening. As Noah lifted the telescope toward the night sky and proudly pointed out a star he claimed belonged to his blue dinosaur astronaut, neither Emily nor Richard corrected him. Some things are more important than being right. Some things are simply worth believing in.